Uluslararası dayanışma, depremin bilinçaltımızdaki etkisi, uluslararası arama ve kurtarma ekiplerimizin çalışmaları ve afet haberciliği temalarını işledik. Şimdi kaldığımız yerden afet, kriz ve risk iletişiminde yeni yönelimlerle devam edeceğiz. O zaman alkışlarınızla ben bu oturumun moderatörü Profesör Doktor Sayın Timothy Sellnow'u davet etmek istiyorum. Kendisi
So Göktuğ was saying we had a great morning discussing the themes of international solidarity, the impact of the earthquake on our subconscious.
Yeah.
Quite interesting stuff. And the work, of course, of international search and rescue teams, as well as disaster journalism. And now this afternoon we're going to start with something equally compelling. We are going to begin discussing new trends in disaster, crisis, and risk communication. So let me welcome to the stage first the moderator for this panel, Professor Timothy Sellnow of the University of Central Florida, and panelists Deanna Sellnow, Martin Löffelholz, Amiso George, and Sjirk Meijer. Please come to the stage.
Evet, teşekkür ediyoruz. Panelimizin moderatörü Florida Merkez Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Doktor Timothy Sellnow olacak. Yine değerli konuşmacılarımız Profesör Doktor Deanna Sellnow, yine Florida Merkez Üniversitesi'nden. İlmenü Teknik Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Doktor Martin Löffelholz, Texas Hristiyan Üniversitesi'nden Profesör Doktor Amiso George ve The Resilience Advisors Network Direktörü Doktor Sjirk Meijer.
Thank you, and we're grateful for the invitation to be here today. Today, we're here because we believe that the right words at the right time save lives. We share a passion together as panelists for identifying the right words for today's disasters and compassion for all of those in need. The right words guide people to protective action, and equally important, they return hope to those whose lives are changed forever. As scholars, we stand with you, Turkey, in a tireless effort to learn from tragedy and to share these lessons with the world. Today, our panelists reflect on new trends in disaster, risk, and crisis communication. I'll introduce briefly our panelists. To my left, Deanna has a long line of internationally recognized research for transforming technical information into comprehensible actions of self-protection for those whose lives are in danger. Martin is a foremost authority in crisis communication who has organized multiple international projects inspiring European scholars, agencies, and leaders to speak with one voice in crisis situations. Amiso has conducted research that's made strides in guiding crisis communication scholars and practitioners to embrace cultural sensitivity in the study and practice of crisis communication. Sjirk leads the Resilience Advisors Network. He is an international leader in the essential effort to enhance resilience in crisis planning, response, and recovery worldwide. Let's start with our first question for our panelists. Given your experience in research, what recommendations do you have for emergency and disaster planning, specifically addressing coordination among multiple authorities, media, and perhaps multiple countries?
Thank you, Tim. I just want to begin by saying thank you to all of the planners for inviting me to be a part of this summit this week. It has been humbling to be here and informative, and I feel truly honored to be a part of this situation. And my heart goes out for all of the victims, their families, their loved ones, and everyone who's involved in this particular devastation that Turkey is facing right now. I'm going to focus specifically on the coordination piece of the question, and I'm going to focus on it from the perspective that I take as an instructional communication researcher. And I'm really going to talk quickly about what I believe we need to do, why we need to do it, and then how we need to do it. I think what we need to be strategic and intentional about building and nurturing global communities of practice like we have here, where there's mutual engagement, where we're making connections with each other who are like-minded people. creating a shared repertoire across our experiences, our cultures, our expertises, to co-construct meaning and decisions to mitigate harms and save lives. Why do we need to do this? Because we now live clearly in a global risk society. And by that, I mean we don't have crises that are limited by time and space. Those boundaries do not exist. They're mega risks and mega crises that transcend boundaries of both time and space. Our old ways won't suffice. We need to develop solutions for the complex and interrelated issues via solutionaries and solutionary thinking. And how are we going to do that? We need to shift our focus from information sharing, from a sender perspective, to learning outcomes, a receiver perspective. For example, there are 3 major kinds of learning. Affective learning. We need to motivate people. How can we use strategic communication to motivate people to attend to the topic and the situation? We have to figure out how to overcome barriers of apathy via relevance, skepticism via trust building, cognitive dissonance from these cosmology episodes of chaos that we experience, through a means by which to articulate uncertainty. Cognitive learning. We need to achieve accurate mutual understanding about what is happening, why, what is being done, by whom, what is known and what is unknown at the time, and what is being done to find out. We have to overcome barriers of access to channels of communication and preference for information-seeking channels. We need to overcome barriers of intelligibility in terms of literacy levels, language translation, and we need to overcome complex competing narratives based on mis, dis, and malinformation by using multiple channels and sources, visual storytelling like we heard about yesterday, AI like we learned about yesterday, and transparency about what we know and what we don't know, and use influencers to our benefit. The third and final is behavioral learning. Gaining compliance to recommended actions to manage risk and protect ourselves and others. So behavioral compliance, behavioral learning. Those barriers that we have to overcome are learned helplessness and fatalism, that hopelessness we've heard talked about throughout the summit, efficacy constraints for self-efficacy and collective efficacy based on different cultural norms and values, different lived experiences, whether we can even be efficacious with the recommended actions that are being suggested to us. We can do so by strategic communication around rhetorical sensitivity, participatory co-construction of action steps, and modeling through actual modeling of behaviors and simulations, using technology for simulations of modeling behavior. So that's where I believe we need to be in terms of going to our next steps in terms of coordinating our efforts.
Very good. Martin?
Yeah, thank you, Deanna. I think that was a very long, but also more or less complete. No, it's not about timing. I think it was a very good overview on the objectives of risk and crisis communication. So this is a very long list. And we as crisis communication researchers, we used to describe crisis communication as a cycle, starting from anticipating and preparing for crisis situations, handling crisis. We heard a lot this morning about the needs of acting in times of crisis, and that I think is often forgotten or not really taken seriously. There's a fourth step in this cycle of crisis communication, which is evaluation. And I think I would like to emphasize this because when we're talking about communication planning, the main question is, what is our basis? Particularly in a country prone to earthquakes, there is already a lot of experience how to deal with it and how to deal also with communication. The question is, and that's a question we also have asked in several empirical studies, are organizations taking evaluation seriously? Because taking it seriously is a very important step in order to prepare for the next crisis. And our empirical studies and also other empirical studies in other countries show that many organizations do not really follow up sufficiently after a crisis has more or less ended, which is a pity because there's a lot of things we can learn from our experiences. And that's why I would like to ask here, what are hindering factors, what are the obstacles for organizations to take into consideration and to evaluate their experiences? And in a current study, we are looking at these organizational factors, and we're distinguishing between 3 different groups of factors. The extra-organizational, which are not really influenced by the organization itself. The intra-organizational, like the hierarchies, the resources, the qualification of the personnel, and many more. And what we call the inter-organizational, so the collaboration between different organizations, for instance, different government institutions. And these factors contribute, on the one hand, to successful crisis communication, but if they don't work well together, then, of course, we'll face a lot of problems, including a lack of evaluation. So my point here is that I think when we're talking about new trends, we first should talk about something which has been identified by research years ago, but which is still not really taken seriously, and that is the idea of a learning organization. So we need to have a culture within an organization to be self-critical, to be open, and to take our experiences within a certain crisis not as granted, but discuss it with each other. I think this conference is a good example for a first reaction. However, in addition to a conference, I think we need also systematic formative evaluations, and I think that could be also a contribution of us in the academe. It doesn't have to take 3 years like classical research projects, but a systematic evaluation is usually one of the most important factors for future successful crisis communication.
Very good. Amiso, your thoughts?
Thank you. And I want to thank the people of Turkey for inviting me, the Directorate of Strategic Communication. And I also want to express my heartfelt condolence to the victims, their families, and all the rescue teams from Turkey and from all around the world who came together to ensure that what we are now talking about, the very successful rescue efforts, we can acknowledge now. So I thank you all, and I join the rest of the world in consoling you and to also remind you of what you already know, that Turkey is stronger than ever. So again, thank you for welcoming me here. And as my colleagues have already mentioned to you, I would just come to this from a perspective of someone who is very much interested in the cultural sensitivities. But we'll start first with, in any kind of crisis, it is very important to gauge the crisis. What kind of crisis is it? And I use a very simple acronym, GMER: gauge, mitigate, execute, and review. And all of these are aspects that those who are in crisis communication are very much aware of. What our research tells us, what is the crisis about? What is the extent of it? And as I've listened to presenters yesterday and today, we saw that in action, because one can't simply jump into a crisis situation without knowing exactly what is the extent of that crisis, therefore ensuring as to what they would prepare and take with them to that crisis location. And then, of course, is to mitigate. Once there is an understanding of what the crisis is, what are the actions, communication actions and otherwise, that has to be taken in order to minimize the impact of the crisis, to contain the crisis, which is, of course, the first thing one wants to do. What are those actions? And of course, one mustn't forget that this is a team effort. I heard my colleague Deanna talk about collaboration, and we've seen that in action with international collaboration, very effective international collaboration. And something else to mention is that these are relationships that were developed before the crisis. Again, a very important aspect of effective crisis communication. Are these relationships, do these relationships exist? And if they don't, cultivate them before crisis actually occurs. So we saw that. So when it comes time for execution, people, the collaborators and partners all come together, as we've seen with this particular earthquake, and they've worked collaboratively together. And I heard one of the presenters say, we're not on a racetrack. Yeah. Absolutely correct. It is not about who did it best. It is about working together, regardless of where they came from, to ensure that they execute the primary goal, which is rescuing, saving people as much as possible. And I want to talk about, after execution then, how do we know what we've done and how well we've done? Evaluation is very important. And that is an aspect, as my colleague Martin has just mentioned, that people tend to forget. Crisis is over. Yay, great job. Let's pat ourselves on the back and move on. That is good. However, we also need to assess what are the things we did well. Let me go back to the issue of collaborators and partners. What was it? What are the specific steps that we took and that our partners took to ensure that this was as seamless an operation as possible? Let's evaluate that. And what are some things that didn't go well? And I heard one of the presenters talk about it. Because everything is not always perfect and will not go perfectly. We have our best plans, as we all know in crisis communication, we have our crisis plans, and then things just go awry. What are those things that went on awry? And how do we plan to ensure that those things do not occur again? So evaluation is very, very important at the end of a crisis, because we look at the lessons we've learned and then use that as future teaching. And Deanna mentioned that. What are the learning? How can we learn? And how can we prepare others who may find themselves in our situation? How can we help them to prepare better? So gauge, mitigate, execute, and review. And another aspect that I want to mention.
Quickly.
Sorry. My particular area of interest is cultural sensitivity. I am from Fort Worth, Texas. I'm in Turkey, thank you. It is very important that anyone going to a different culture to do any kind of work, and in this case, crisis, must be sensitive to the culture of the persons or the population that they're working with. That means make an effort to learn about them. You may or may not be able to speak the language, that's all right. You may have a translator, but learn about the important aspects of their culture or their religion. So when you're communicating with them in such a time, at such a time when they're very vulnerable, it is important to show respect, understand their culture, because that also builds trust. And as we heard some of the speakers talk about, that even though they were the ones working to rescue the victims were kind to them. And you might wonder, well, how did that happen? The building of trust doesn't have to be something that happens over a long period of time. It could be a very short period, simply by showing some cultural sensitivity about the persons that you are working with. It takes so little, but it has such a profound impact, as we've heard. Our research tells us that if we make just a little extra effort to learn about the persons whom we're working with in times of vulnerability, in times of crisis, and we are sensitive to their culture, their religion, that it goes a long way in how they would respond to us, and it goes a long way in building that trust that we all wish to have with the persons that we work with.
Thank you. Sjirk.
Thank you. My background is a little bit different. Someday, I don't know why, I got a PhD, and then I got diverted into crisis management. And, well, disasters has been a big part of my life, and still I'm seeing what's happened in Turkey is such enormous that I can really feel the impact also personally. And I want to wish the people of Turkey a lot of strength. The nice thing about sitting in a panel as last is that you don't have to say a lot anymore, because everything is already said, and most probably they are far more wiser than I am. But I want to work further on what Amiso, my neighbor, said, and that is about relationships and trust building. What happened now in Turkey is such enormous. In scale, it's unprecedented. But even when we look at the people who are coming to help, the heroes who sat here before, in their normal life, they already work in crisis. In normally work, they are a volunteer firefighter. They are in that kind of jobs. They are already, and they come to help. So it's a matter of skill that they are used to work in crisis and just scale up to this big crisis. And that is also, in my perception, how communication should work, in crisis communication. It's not about preparing for this big one. It's about using the right way of communicating in everyday life, in the normal, I don't know if that exists, a normal disaster, but even a car crash is a disaster for a family in its own skill. If a family is killed in a car crash, it's devastating. And in those times, you also need to have the right communication and do the right thing. So it's not about, oh, have a deep breath, let us prepare for the big thing. No, it's prepare for the small ones and grow into the big things. Another one I want to build further on is this relationship trust building. I'm a big fan, well, it's maybe a wrong wording, but I'm not an English native speaker, you know. I'm quite fond of the concept of community resilience. Preparing for disasters is also building communities to be prepared for disasters. So it's working on the local level. A disaster, even a disaster like this scale, it's not a national disaster, it's also at every village, neighborhood, at that scale, it's also a disaster. Disasters are real, with real people, very local. Even if it's widespread, it's local. And, well, maybe not for cyber, blah, blah, blah, but it is quite local. And if you can already build in preparation strong communities who are prepared for big events, who are knowing each other better, because knowing each other is helping each other. And that can build during an event, during a disaster, but you can also emphasize it in working to it. I know that in the Istanbul area, the Turkish government already acknowledged this, that when the big earthquake hits Istanbul, and we know there's a big chance of happening in the next 20 years, the communication message is don't rely on the government for the first 27 hours, because we don't know if we can come to you. So prepare yourself, but also, and that's their second program, prepare your community around you. So, and then it's getting really strong, because then you're prepared, and then the people are well aligned. I want to stop now for this, because I think that clock is my total speaking time.
Yeah, it's time to move on. So, let's shift now to focus on learning from disasters, a real emphasis that we have at this meeting. I'd like each of you, moving a little more quickly, if you could give me one example of what you would say a successful lesson learned from organizations that performed well or countries that performed well. If you could just share one lesson each. We'll start with Deanna.
That's a great idea. Thank you, Tim. But I'm going to talk about something that's a lesson that I want to take from this conference.
Sure.
So I'm going to twist it a little bit there.
Mm-hmm.
We have been doing a really good job with those 3 R's, resilience, response, and recovery during the short term. And I think that those are critical, and we need to keep doing them. But I was thinking about this concept about going forward, and what do we need to do next or do more of? And what I would argue is those short-term responses are critical for saving lives, and we need to keep doing them. But in some sense, they're like a bandage, because they're not enough to heal those deeper wounds of trauma that will help restore hope. And so I would argue that going forward, we need to add one more R to that list, and that's renewal. And by renewal, I mean effective communication for renewal is characterized by learning from the event or events, after the event or events, to transform people in ways that help them regain their agency and empowerment going forward, which requires a paradigm shift. Renewal begins not with the senders who share information, but rather with the receivers, those stakeholders, those victims and their relatives and the people that are involved in the crisis events, to share their stories. They need to be seen. We need to make the invisible visible and heard and valued. Those shared stories become the foundation upon which renewal can take place. Strategic communication for long-term sustainable solutions in crisis and disaster contexts must begin with making sure everyone has a seat at the table to be seen and heard and valued. Through these stories, we can go beyond resilience, response, and recovery to renewal that transforms people and societies, not by putting back into place what was before the catastrophic event, but instead to transform people and processes into what will be better going forward. It's like the caterpillar who has to go in through the struggling of the cocoon, the event, to ultimately be transformed into that butterfly that comes out of the cocoon.
Very good. Thank you. Martin?
I think there are several examples we could look at, and I would like to bring up the example of New Zealand. New Zealand has been studied by researchers, different types of crises regarding earthquakes. There was this 2010, 2011 earthquakes near Christchurch, and after that the New Zealand government set up a dedicated crisis team, and from then onwards they have been working quite well in order to prepare for future crises, and this paid off during the pandemic. I think one of the reasons why New Zealand did quite well during the pandemic, so the crisis response to the pandemic in New Zealand was also praised for being quite successful. There are numerous other examples when we look at the pandemic, for instance, in Taiwan and some others. However, I would like to bring up a topic which Amiso has already mentioned, cultural sensitivity. What we are discussing now since a few years, unfortunately only since few years, is that many of the theoretical approaches and empirical studies we have been conducting on risk and crisis communication are originating from the so-called West, especially from North America and some European countries. And that turns out to be a problem for, let's say, for the rest, for all the other countries. I've been working and living many years of my life in different Asian countries. For instance, in Indonesia, I was president of a private university in Jakarta, and as you know, probably know, Indonesia is at the ring of fire, so also earthquake prone. And we need to prepare, all of us, and even me as president, we have to be alert, we have to prepare, we need to establish a crisis team. And when I, as a crisis communication researcher, tried to utilize all the knowledge we had, and there is a lot of knowledge, I found out that, okay, partly we can use it, however, we have to be careful generalizing it. We have to localize, and we have to adapt it to the local community. So that is, I think, one of my major practical messages. Finally, I think another aspect which I observed, or we observed in our recent studies, is everyone knows that in a situation of crisis there is an information overload, which is a challenge for organizations, for media, for the first responders. I think it has been mentioned also this morning. What we are underestimating is that in protected multiple crises like pandemic, or let's say the aftermath of earthquakes and natural disasters, there's also what I would like to call information fatigue. People are getting tired of listening to messages, to media reports on crisis and the consequences. And I think that is also one of the reasons, because media attention is then getting lower, people don't like to talk about it anymore, they are happy that the crisis is over. The pandemic is a very good example for that, because we have been dealing with it 2 or 3 years, and now no one really wants to deal with it anymore. But I think that is one of the major reasons, to connect it with what I said before, why there is a lack of evaluation in the system, and that is one of the major problems.
Very good, makes good sense. So Amiso.
Okay, you would notice that our responses sort of build on each other, because there is a connectivity, connectedness aspect of it. What I've learned in my research in crisis communication, like we all know, is that clear and timely communication is essential. People want to know, for instance, in the case of the earthquake recently here in Turkey, people want to know, where is it happening? Do I have relatives there? Do I have friends there? They want to know, so they would know what action to take. So it's not enough to just share the information with them, but it's very, very important to basically tell them what is being done about it. As one of the presenters said yesterday, and I'm looking at you there, tell us, basically, do and show us how you're going to do it, and also show us that you care. So timely information is very important, and clarity of the information is very important. And whatever the local language is, to ensure that that information is provided in that local language. And why is this so important? To minimize fear, because people are in a very vulnerable situation. They do not know what to do. And also to prevent the spread of disinformation. We live in a social media age where people can use pictures, images from something completely different and pass that off as an image from that particular area of the crisis. So it's important that information is clear, consistent, and timely. Now, how do we make all of this happen? From what research has taught us, that community involvement is very important in sharing this information. Again, these are relationships that we should have established prior to the crisis. So when the crisis does occur and we're sharing this information, the community leaders are our partners in helping to disseminate that information. And another thing that is very important that Martin just alluded to is that we can't just use a Western approach, a linear approach, and assume that social media will do all the work for us. Certainly use it, but are there other means of communicating to the target audience that we're trying to reach? Then take advantage of it. So there isn't one set rule, but what works for one particular community or one particular audience may not work for another. So identify what works. Clear and timely information involving the community in the dissemination of this information using both normal, what is considered normal, the traditional media, social media, as well as other channels of communication to get to an audience. Because at times like this, information is king. And we've seen that with the COVID experience, or rather the pandemic that we all experienced, that there was a multiplicity of dubious information and people acted on it because in some cases, certain governments, and I'll use ours as an example, didn't give out consistent, accurate information. And so people were inundated with all kinds of information that was detrimental
Yes.
to their health.
Yep. And we'll move on because we're running out of time. Yes, Sjirk.
I will make it short. Yes, you're right. Thanks. I had something in my head, and it's okay. You said it all and more. One example, I already mentioned the example of Istanbul, of course, which is a great way of communicating, I think. Just telling in front what can happen and what to expect and how to act. And also train people on that one. I think they trained about 300,000 people in that program in Istanbul. Okay, Istanbul is 11 million, so it's still not a big portion, but still it's very considerable. I had something in my mind and now I'm lost it. I was thinking about what you said about misinformation. This is also things that can be learned, how to deal with it. The human mind is very capable, and we are all individuals working together in this world. And if we have the right tools, we can deal with a lot of misinformation. We can deal with a lot of fake news if we are trained in it. So if that is also part of preparing for disaster, but also preparing for life nowadays, I think. Know what is not real. So, and that is also where in resilience building, the schools are so important that we learn, we give people the tools to act in the right way. You don't have to learn how to act, because they will act anyway. But people will always act on basis what they can and what information they have. And if you can teach them to filter the right information, that will be for them very helpful to act in the right way. So,
very good. Our final question. What is the responsibility of researchers in general and academia specifically in increasing public awareness of disasters and disaster response? Deanna?
This one is really, really near and dear to my heart, and I'm provide a little context to my answer. During the pandemic, the portion when we were all locked down at home, I became addicted to watching CNN news. And as a crisis communication expert, what I was doing was getting frustrated when I would hear people saying exactly the wrong thing for the public awareness in terms of the issues that we were dealing with the pandemic, COVID-19. And I was, oh, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And pretty soon I started to realize this is my fault. because that means us as academic researchers are not getting the word out to the people that need to use it, can be used, find it useful on the ground in the work that they're doing. And so I was implicated at that point. And since then, I have been committed to these two things that I'd like to mention right now. One of them is we need to be strategic about our research. And by that I mean we need to make our generalizable conclusions and implications from our research accessible and useful to those doing the work on the ground and in the fields. We need to do so by situating our research in applied contexts rather than in hypothetical situations. We need to conduct our research together with the people who are living and working in those contexts. And we need to share our research widely beyond academic, esoteric academic journal publications. And one example I can talk about very quickly with that is that Tim and I have done a lot of work developing and testing and measuring an idea, the thing we call the idea model for effective crisis and risk communication. And the point of the idea model is to create a theoretically grounded, data-driven, experimentally, empirically tested model for effective instructional communication in contexts that can be easily understood and employed by practitioners when time is of the essence. And we are very pleased with the work that we've been doing over the last almost 2 decades with that. But it's not enough to have it in the Journal of Applied Communication and Research or the Journal of Communication or whatever journal it might be. So since my conviction, we have been doing things like submitting it to government agency newsletters where it can go out to the Journal of Emergency Management where the managers can read it, and writing not just the academic research article, but at the same time write something for practicing professionals that can get the usefulness out of the work that we're doing. So there's that piece. The second one is to be strategic about our global relationship building. Thank you for inviting us here, because this is what I'm talking about. We need to find opportunities to visit people that are like-minded where they're at and start seizing these opportunities to make connections with others, because together we can do so much more synergistically than any of us can do alone in our silos. So that relationship building, attending conferences and summits, doing these kinds of networking. I would like to put a plug in for something that we just developed. We have developed an International Crisis and Risk Communication Association. And one of the things that association will be doing, we have been hosting a conference in Orlando, Florida, the US of A. Consider yourself invited. It's in March of every year, and it's to put practicing professionals and academic researchers together in the same room for two and a half days, similar to this wonderful work you're doing here, to talk about these issues and make better what we're doing going forward. International Crisis and Risk Communication Conference is in March of each year. So that's one thing that we're doing since my conviction. Another thing that we're doing is we just created a LinkedIn page called the Sellnow Group. Please find us and follow us. This is an opportunity for us to have ongoing exchange together in the quiet times, before and after, when there isn't a horrible, devastating tragedy like what Turkey is going through right now, that we're connecting and building our relationships with one another all year long. Strategic about our research, strategic about our relationships with one another. That's the responsibility of researchers in academy, in my opinion.
Very good. Martin, some of the relationships that you've established.
I think that that Deanna has given a great overview on how academe could contribute also to practice. In fact, when we are looking at our discipline, our field, which is communication studies, compared to other areas of research, risk and crisis communication is very practical, very applied, because many of our research projects are funded by organizations who have a certain interest in dealing and mitigating the impact of crisis. Secondly, I myself, for instance, in my first career, I was a journalist, and I still remember one of my first jobs was to cover the war in Sri Lanka, 1983. And that was giving me, I would say, lifetime experience, probably also raised my interest in this field of research. And I never forget that we as researchers also have an obligation to society. I think that's what Deanna also meant. Secondly, connected to what we have already discussed, cultural sensitivity, etc. I think that all larger countries need also a center for risk and crisis communication research. I have looked at the state of research on Turkey and risk and crisis communication. A number of colleagues are conducting empirical studies in this field. For instance, when we look at natural disasters and earthquakes, there are some studies analyzing the communication after the quakes in Izmir 2020, and they came to some very important results. And the question is, in terms of learning organization, are we dealing with that? Are we taking these experiences and findings seriously also in practice? So we need conferences like that. Deanna has mentioned it, but we also need a forum, probably also a regular forum, for researchers and interested practitioners to work together. I myself am also involved in the Turkish-German University in Istanbul, in Beykoz, and we have we are now implementing since 2 years a new MA communication study program. And one of the concentration areas is risk and crisis communication as well as digital communication. And in preparation for this conference, I looked also at what my colleagues on campus on the Turkish-German University are doing. And I found the Allianz Technik Earthquake and Fire Testing and Training Center, which was established 2019 on the campus of Turkish-German University. So one of my next steps will be to visit the colleagues there, because the technical perspective engineering in order to prepare for future earthquakes is a very important part, but it's even better if we could align it and connect it with the social sciences and especially also with communication. So we should discuss, maybe in different fora, we should discuss where and when we could develop such a center here in Turkey, dealing with risk and crisis communication on a regular basis, because that is a prerequisite for many things. For instance, educating qualified staff to be prepared, to know how to deal with risk and crisis communication, because that's one of the major problems organizations are facing. They have a few qualified communication specialists, but the majority of people have never been going through a formal training. And I think that is very worse. A large country like Turkey, I think, should also have a center like that. Wherever it will be organized later, maybe even as a network of different universities, but I think that could be a very productive and constructive outcome also of this conference. So I'm really happy that I was invited to this conference so that I can also help thinking about these matters and probably bring it up later in different contexts.
Very good progress. Thank you, Martin. Amiso.
I should say my colleagues have aptly captured exactly what I have on my notes, but to very quickly summarize, the importance of conducting research, of course, and disseminating the research in not just academic journals, but also business journals, as well as, in this case, emergency communication journals, very important. And another note that I have here, collaboration with stakeholders, as Martin has just shared with us, working with the German Turkish University and providing education and training. That's very important. It's not just about doing that at universities, but also at conferences such as this, where perhaps a part of the conference would be devoted to a training, or just simply carving out some time for education and training in disaster and risk management, and providing from our research educational materials, training manuals, and of course these days everything is electronic, so it doesn't matter where in the world we are, we can continue to provide that kind of training. And the last point that I have here is to have risk and crisis communication experts, perhaps working as advocates with various governments in helping them to understand. Perhaps not every government is as fortunate as the one here in Turkey, but perhaps smaller governments, working with them to recognize the importance of planning ahead for crisis and risk management and preparing them so they can better handle such situations when it does arise, because it will arise. I mean, and also today we all know that crisis is really transboundary. While it may happen in one country, the consequences and the impact broadly felt. So again, our job as researchers is to help people to see beyond what is happening at that particular time, to prepare them for it, and also to prepare them by providing our research in very practical terms to enable them to do a much better job. It's not going to be perfect, but to do a much better job than they could have done without the data to support their work.
Very good advice. Thank you. Sjirk.
Thank you. Can I ask a question to the audience? Who of you is academic, is a researcher? Okay. I see not as many hands. So I will only offend my fellow panelists then. That's good. One of the things I want to say about research is getting away from this thought that there is a research community and that there exists something like a closed entity which is called science. And I'm a big fan again of citizen science, and I think citizen science can be very helpful in crisis communication science. Citizen science is that you go to communities or that you use or teach citizens to do science, and then they can do their own science. And you can use all standards which apply for science. You can apply it, but give them the tools again and let them work from their perspective and their base, their community base. I've done such a project in Ukraine, and it was amazing what kind of research you can do if you really go into the community, teach them about science, and what kind of results you can derive. But also how that whole process will help a community to build further on its own resilience. A second thing, and now I'm going from the low community level to the European level. I'm happy that I'm also running the Crisis Management Innovation Network, CMINE, C-M-M-I-N-E. And in that network, we cluster Horizon Europe projects on disaster reduction, on border management, all kinds of projects, those big Horizon projects of Europe, which Turkey is eligible for. So Turkey can participate in that kind of projects. And we cluster those projects and helping them with disseminating the results of those big research and innovation projects. Because what you see in big projects is that they get loose from the ground and hovering somewhere in the air, maybe joining the iCloud or something. But they need to touch base again and disseminate the results in a practical manner also. And that is where clustering projects, where they can interact with each other, can also help in disseminating the results in a more useful manner. So that was my closing remark. Thank you, Tim.
Very good, Sjirk. Thank you. I'd like to thank our panelists. I would like to thank the planners for inviting us. And I'd like to leave you with a thought, and that is our shared hope. And our shared hope is that in crisis situations, we all listen, learn, and honor the lives of those we mourn by seeking and finding the right words that can indeed save lives. Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thank you all so much. Really such valuable advice and guidance there. So great to have you. Thank you. We appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Teşekkür ediyoruz biz de değerli konuklarımıza katkıları için.
And so let's move on to our next talk.
Evet.
And we'll welcome our next speaker to the stage. This is very interesting because, yeah, we're talking a lot about kind of strategic communications in the face of disaster. But our next speaker will be talking about crisis communication during disasters in the context of the grief cycle.
Evet, şimdi ara vermeden devam edeceğiz. Yine keynote'larla devam ediyoruz. 6. keynote'umuz yaz evresi bağlamında afetlerde kriz iletişimi diyeceğiz. Malezya Kriz Yönetimi Merkezi kurucusu Sayın Nordin Abdullah huzurlarınızda olacak.
Nordin Abdullah, founder of the Malaysia Crisis Management Center. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum and a very good afternoon to everybody. Like all speakers, I also want to express my condolences to the Turkish people, as well as the Syrian people, and everyone who has contributed to the disaster response. We thank you